Hi, good afternoon, good
Hello.
evening, everybody.
Welcome to Unbridled. We are back for our
Your
Wednesday night
local
live.
friendly live Wednesday night talk show with our wonderful guest, Caroline Rossner. Thank you for joining us
Hello.
today.
Thank you for having me tonight. So it's going to be a good time.
Absolutely. So I shared this on the MGAA page because everybody knows that you are an MGAA member as well. And I
Yes.
figured we'd ask how you got started in mounted games before we kick
So
off the rest of the discussion.
that's a great story. So I did games in Pony Club when I was younger, and this was back in the day before adults could be in Pony Club too. So I didn't realize that you could continue on as an adult. And so after I moved to Virginia and got set up here is when I went to my friend's barn, and her offer in the exact words was, "Hey, do you want to get drunk and fall off ponies with us?" And I was like, "Well, I can't drink, but I could definitely fall off a pony." And so here we are.
Please
So
tell me who that friend is.
it was Maria Johnson.
I love it.
It was a
Oh
great
my gosh.
introduction back to games. And so,
I mean, that's the vibe, definitely.
yes. So,
Very
so I've been
European.
back doing mounted games since 2015. So
It's
a while
crazy.
now.
Yeah, I was looking back through some of your pictures when I was pulling together like the little clip art screenshot thing.
Yes.
And so you've ridden multiple ponies in games over the years now.
You can see the progression in height going downwards.
Yeah, I definitely
So,
started to get wiser about it.
yes. My first horse ever was 16 hands. She was an appendix quarter horse. She did everything. Pulled a cart. We did eventing. Trail rides, fox hunting. I did pony club games on her, which was a stretch. That's how I got so good at leaning off the side of horses.
Yeah.
And then I started out with her at mounted games, and unfortunately, she got an injury in probably 2016. Which she had a lot of injuries over her lifetime. She's a little bit of a problem child. She had no good legs left by the end. But we worked on a lot of legs. She's the reason I'm so good at leg wrapping, because I had to wrap a lot of legs in my lifetime.
Everyone needs that pony in their life.
Yes. So then my husband's horse, Blitzen, we brought him to a games practice, and he was amazing. I mean, he acted like he'd been doing it his entire life. He didn't bat an eye at anything. So, and he was actually pretty competitive. So then he became my next games pony until he was 34. And I was like, you should probably retire a little bit.
It's about time.
So he was still being ridden, but I felt like maybe competitions were going to be a little bit much. I was worried about tendon injuries at that age, since there's a lot of turning and accelerating at high speed. And he was not one that would let the horse next to him win. He was going to race. And he was fast. He was amazing.
That's awesome.
So he got officially retired from competition at 34. And unfortunately, he has also since passed away, but at 37. So he was still sound and rideable till the end. He just, his eyes didn't keep working for him. So it was a little problematic. And then after retiring him, because he was, well, it depended where you measured him. If you measured him officially at the withers, he was 15-1. If you measured it where his actual back was, because he was a little sway backed, it was a little closer to 14-2. So he got a little shorter in the middle. So then I progressed on to Summer, who is 14-2. She's my little fat red quarter horse that Courtney actually is riding in competitions, because she's a little scary at games. She's very good at other things. Amazing trail horse. She's wonderful for fox hunting. She has absolutely no qualms about being left behind by the group. She is going to keep walking at her speed and not any faster. So if the whole rest of everybody else leaves, oh well. She said, see ya. I'll catch up later. But, games is a little overwhelming. And unfortunately,
It's
a lot of the team that I rode with initially when starting back, kind of carried on to other things. We had some people go off to college, people having kids, building houses. And so sort of everyone that I practiced with disappeared.
Yeah.
So poor Summer kind of got tossed into games without a whole lot of practice under her belt, but she's done pretty well, all things considering. Just has a lot of opinions about things. So, and then, actually, Mocha, my current games pony, used to be Maria's games pony, so I really can't take any of the credit for her training. All of that would go to Maria and everyone that rode her before, but she's
Aw.
absolutely amazing. And so I've gone down to 12.3 now, so I can reach a lot more things.
What
It's
is
hard to
Mocha?
believe that she's 12.3.
Yeah.
She's 12.3, so we officially sticked her because we thought she was 13.2, and I was like, that looks like more than 6 inches, like, or more than 4 inches that she's shorter than Summer. So I put my sort of weight and height measuring tape on her, and I was like, I'm getting 12.3. And then I went to my friend's barn who actually had like level concrete floors instead of hills, and an official weight or height stick, and she was in fact 12.3. So I was
Wow.
like, okay, bonus.
Boom.
So
Got a pocket
reached it
pony
really
now.
easily. Yes. So I honestly have no idea what kind of breed she is. We're assuming some kind of Welsh pony cross mix thing.
She's like that Sabino color.
Yeah. So
It's very
and she's
unique.
a little Roni too. I'm sorry, I don't know if you hear this cat in the background. He's very demanding. My noise canceling might be working, but there may be a cat appearing in my screen in a hot. He's very insistent. but yeah, she's absolutely amazing, and she's incredibly sturdy.
Yeah.
So
And
although
is that who you're planning on like competing with this year?
yes,
In
yes.
025? Okay.
So when I had her out in 025 last year, the year before I think was when I got her. I don't know, all the years have blended together now. But I think I got her the year before, and she wasn't quite in good enough shape to actually compete because she'd had a few years off and needed a little muscle first. Although I might just go ahead and take her to the Olympics because she just jumped a 4-foot gate earlier this week. So yeah. So apparently I should turn her into a jumper.
You should hop her over some fences and see how she does,
Right?
because that was impressive.
Well, I think she lived her life
For you all who
beforehand as a
didn't
hunter
see
pony.
it, this is her pony, her 12.3 pony. I can't get it to focus on her.
Literally
Right.
flying.
Literally.
And there's Summer chasing her over said gate. That's why she jumped it. Summer and her opinions. But yeah, so I think
man.
I know.
in a past life she was a hunter pony. Whether or not she could jump
might have
4
been a
feet with
deer.
my body weight on her is a different story. But yeah, I think there may be some deer in there. She's a tester too. Like she'll take her little nose and like run along the fence just to see if the electric's on.
Oh my gosh.
100%. 100%.
So
yeah.
You are in veterinary medicine.
Yes.
How did you fall into that career path?
I think I just always was planning on doing this. When I was really, really young, I wanted to actually grow up to be a horse. But once I realized that was not an option, I decided I wanted to work on horses. And so I don't really remember there was a time that I decided. I think I just was like, well, I'm just going to be a vet. So then I did, sort of pre-vet track in undergrad. So graduated with a degree in animal science with a minor in genetics and chemistry, and then went straight on to vet school.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, just kind of a lot of college. So yeah, just knew and just carried on with it. So here we are.
So what was your experiences like just out of college? Your first like job? Have you bounced around with where you're employed with that? I know at least some of the vet techs I knew, I felt like they kind of like had to find the team that fit them.
Yes. So with equine, vet school is a little bit different than med school, in that after med school you have to do like residencies and things like that. With veterinary medicine, once you graduate and get your license in whatever state you plan to practice on, you can just kind of go right into things. Equine has kind of a mixed batch in that a lot of people do go into internships, afterwards, just to kind of get more hands-on training, because depending on where you go to school, you may or may not get a whole lot of actual hands-on training, because horses are kind of an awkward category between livestock and between pets, because they don't really fit into either. We don't eat them in this country, so they don't really fall under the food animal category, but they're not companion animals either, so they kind of have a category of their own as far as they're worth a lot of money and they're expensive. And so that can be something where, depending on where you go, you may or may not have access to a lot of actual hands-on. NC State was really awesome because they have a teaching animal unit there. So the school actually owns all of the livestock animals. So you actually get to do a lot of different things that way. And they've got different externships that you can do in school as well, where you can actually go right along with local practices and get some experience too. And so, I'd say it's fairly well split on whether people do an extra or an internship after school versus going into practice with, say, a mentor. I went directly into practice right after graduation. Basically, I took 2 weeks off and went to a wedding in Germany, and then I was basically in it. And so I had a really good mentor coming out. So he and that's currently the practice that I'm at now. So I was there for 3 years after graduating. It was incredibly busy. So it was really, in reality, more like working there for 6 or 7 years if you actually added up the number of hours, because it was basically 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, split between 2 people. So we covered a lot of ground, a lot of territory, but we really did a lot. And I think having good mentorship is important if you're not going to do an internship after school. So I was with the practice for 3 years. I actually stayed in the same area of Virginia and just was at a different job, and then came back in October after the current owner retired, because otherwise there was no other practitioners in this area. The closest equine vet to where I am was a 50-mile drive away. So after he retired, I was like, well, I live here and I'm an equine vet, so I guess I'll fill that role. So here we are, back to full circle.
That's crazy. I mean, that's really cool though, that you've kind of had one place that you've been able to cultivate and grow up in, even if it has been a lot.
Right. So
do you do you guys service a really large area, for calls?
Yeah, so we go to about 9 different counties. So we cover a significant amount of ground. It used to be about a 2-hour radius out from the center of the practice. Unfortunately, with there just being one vet now, we've had to really cut back on areas. So we're only really able to go about an hour out, just because of good, that's on my list, yes. Just because of the actual physical amount of distance that I can cover during a day. So I can only travel so far, and in order to make things work, we just have to really kind of stay within an area where we're comfortable. So
well, Sailor's asking, can you talk a bit on required vaccines for showing, and in your opinion, the most important practices to keep your horse safe from exposure?
Absolutely.
I love this question, because the vet's coming out in literally 2 weeks to give my spring shots, and she's like, what do you want? And I'm like, tell me what I need.
And this is going to vary by geographic location, because there are going to be some things that are going to be more endemic in certain areas, places that are going to be higher risk. So the core vaccines, which are the ones that is recommended for every horse everywhere in the United States. Obviously, other countries don't have some of these diseases either. But that would be rabies first and foremost. It's a zoonotic disease. It is 100% fatal. It is transmissible to people. I actually, unfortunately, had an exposure last week and just had to get a post-exposure follow-up series. So that's been super fun. So, it's that absolutely, I think, is the most recommended vaccine, just because horses are outside. They have a lot of exposure to skunks, raccoons, bats, foxes, you name it. They live outdoors, and because it's so easily transmissible to people, that one I would say is the most important. The other core vaccines are going to be Eastern encephalitis, Western encephalitis, West Nile. So those are going to be all your vector-borne or spread through bugs, typically mosquitoes, but it can be other biting flies that cause encephalitis or neurologic disease. And then tetanus would be the other core vaccine. It's a bacteria. It's found in the environment. Usually it causes death by muscle rigidity. So tetanus and botulism are the same class of bacteria, but one causes a rigid paralysis where your muscles tense up and eventually you can't breathe because your diaphragm won't move. And botulism causes what's called a flaccid paralysis. So essentially you lose all control of your muscles and they don't move and then you can't breathe. So actually botulism is Botox. That stands for botulism toxin, what people inject so that their muscles don't move and they don't get frown lines. So yeah, you're just getting a really diluted form of botulism for that.
Oh my God.
Botulism treats what?
So botulism is a disease that's also spread in the environment that causes a flaccid paralysis. So it's kind of the opposite effect of tetanus. Tetanus, it makes your muscles super stiff. So then usually they die because they can't breathe because they can't move their diaphragm.
And you vaccinate for botulism whenever they're eating, like primarily from like round bales and things like that, right?
Yeah, so it's an anaerobic bacteria for botulism, and so round bales where you don't get a lot of air coming to the center of it is a high risk. A lot of times you'll get it from like small animals like mice and things like that that get baled in. With square bales, because the flakes are smaller and you're kind of putting your hands in there and opening them and moving them around, usually you're throwing away that bad hay. So yeah, the core vaccines would be considered Eastern encephalitis, Western encephalitis, West Nile, tetanus, and rabies. And then the risk-based vaccines, which are going to be depending on what you do with your horse. Horses that just live up at home, they never go anywhere. They may not need anything more than those core vaccines. But if you're traveling, I would absolutely recommend the flu rhino vaccine. So rhino pneumonitis is going to be your equine herpes virus, so your EHV1 and EHV4. And this might actually be a good time for the Equine Disease Communication Center website. So EHV is the one that you hear about on the news that causes the neurologic disease that is very easily spread horse to horse. Several years ago, it shut down the whole Western circuit out on the West Coast. Ohio is currently having a big outbreak of it. And so anywhere that has a horse that is either exposed or that tests positive for the disease, that whole facility is going to be quarantined and shut down. So that is a reportable disease in the US. And so if you want to track those reportable diseases, the website is called equinediseasecc.org. And so that is going to actually show you where they've had confirmed outbreaks of those cases, when they were. And so sometimes that can be something where if you're like, just pick any venue. So let's say the Grange, if there was a show there before MGAA came and you're like, oh, wow, they just had, a horse that was at that location that had that then came and had herpes and there was an outbreak, I might not want to travel there. If the competition's the next day, I might say, hey, let's wait on that. And so there's the website. They also have an app that you can use on your phone too, but it's a really nice way of tracking the diseases. So in the alerts tab, you can click on that tab, which is where we are. You can pick the disease, and then it's got a list of all the reportable diseases. You can pick your state, you can pick your dates. And so then it'll show you, all these will tell you exactly where it is, how many were exposed, whether the outbreak's being closed or not. So, it's just kind of an interesting website as far as tracking diseases and being able to know what you're at risk for. So, I would say for horses that are traveling on a regular basis, being exposed to other horses, especially if you're planning on, staying at places, flu rhino would absolutely be a vaccine that I would recommend. And to answer Joy's question, if you're doing a lot, twice a year would be recommended. For the southern areas of the practices, so Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama, places like that, you would also want to do those mosquito-borne diseases twice a year. So Eastern, Western, and West Nile, we recommend vaccinating twice a year for as well. Places like Florida, where it's never cold and the mosquitoes never die, they actually will vaccinate quarterly for those mosquito-borne diseases. And there are other ones too that can have exposure, particularly like Florida and Texas, import-export states. Venezuelan encephalitis would also be a vaccine to be considered. We don't really have much of it in Virginia, so I don't tend to have that on my list of vaccines that I do frequently. Another vaccine to strongly consider for horses that are traveling for competitions, especially that are staying in different barns where other horses are traveling from different areas and staying, would be the strangles vaccine. The newer one, the intranasal one, tends to have way less ill effects than the intramuscular one. So the intramuscular strangles used to cause a lot of vaccine soreness reactions, abscesses, things like that. So the intranasal one's much safer. If they've never had it before, it would be the initial vaccine, then a booster 4 to 6 weeks later, and then you can revaccinate annually. The other option is you can check their serum M protein titers, and if they're high, you don't have to vaccinate. If they're starting to get low, you can revaccinate. So that's another option for strangles as well. Some other ones that I see in Virginia, but you may not see other places. Potomac horse fever is very common here. Maryland too, probably because you've got your Potomac River Basin.
Yeah.
That one is one of those vaccines where it's not 100% preventative, but it will reduce the severity of the clinical signs, because normally Potomac horse fever will cause a fatal diarrhea, because horses don't tend to cope very well with diarrhea compared to other species. And so that's one that is usually annually, but in areas that have a lot of exposure, it can be given twice a year as well. So I do consider that as a core vaccine.
Linda says I was told not to do the strangles vaccine after a certain point in age of the horse.
So I wouldn't have an issue with age per se, but that goes back to that serum M protein titer, in that if they've had lots of vaccines over the years and they've still got a high immune response, they're more likely to have a reaction to the vaccine. So, you know, say your horse is 25 and it's gotten a strangles vaccine every year for the last 15 years, they probably do have pretty decent immunity to it. And so really the only way to know is to actually check that serum M protein. For the vast majority of horses, that is an expensive test, and so a lot of people don't necessarily do it. But I wouldn't necessarily say age would be the reason, rather than it would be just if they've had a lot of vaccines over time, that they've probably got enough immunity. And sometimes if you have a lot of immunity and you vaccinate, you're more likely to have a reaction to the vaccine.
Interesting.
Okay. Oh, oops, sorry. Joy says, how is Potomac horse fever transmitted? Is that something to worry about if we are not in that area other than traveling?
So it's spread in two different ways. And the most common way is going to be through aquatic snails. So wet areas next to kind of rivers, things like that. But the second stage of the trematode is actually going to be spread through biting flies. So like caddisflies, mayflies, things like that. So you have to kind of have both of those things. So I would say for the vast majority of people that are traveling, if you're using fly spray and you're not letting them drink out of creeks, rivers, things like that as you're going along, the risk of exposure is going to be pretty low. So if you're not in an area that's endemic, then, you know, certainly talk to your vet about what they think. But the odds are going to be pretty low of having both of those conditions for exposure. Whereas if you live in the Potomac River Valley Basin, then you're going to have a lot of exposure.
Yeah.
You know, and so it can be spread both of those ways, but it's not going to be transmitted horse to horse. It's either going to be through aquatic snails or through things like mayflies, caddisflies. So you can absolutely minimize their exposure that way if you don't live in an endemic area.
Interesting.
And then the other vaccines that I just wanted to touch on, we kind of touched on botulism a little bit. Certainly feeding round bales is one of the higher risk factors. Botulism often can be a fatal disease. if you don't catch it right away, because you do get that flaccid muscle paralysis. And if you can't move your muscles and you can't move your diaphragm, then you can't breathe. So, that's a problem. But that being said, if you're feeding exclusively square bales, or if you're, checking your round bales and, pulling flakes off, feeding them that way, the odds are going to be pretty low. There's tons of people that feed round bales that never have issues with it, but there is a vaccine for it. The initial series is going to be 3 vaccines given a month apart, and then annually after that. So that one's really pretty risk-based as far as the environment, and whether or not your horses are in an environment where you could pick it up. If you've got good quality hay and you're not finding small animals bailed and moldy bits and things like that, then the odds are pretty low. And then one of the ones that is very common here that actually is a little bit of a newer vaccine, it came out in, I want to say, 2018, is the lepto vaccine. And we see a lot of lepto here. It's also one that you would vaccinate small animals for as well, particularly dogs is probably where you've heard that. The lepto vaccine is in horses, an initial 2 series vaccine and then booster annually. Lepto is a bacteria that's spread through urine. And so oftentimes you're going to find it at water sources, because typically rodents or other animals are going to those water sources and dribbling urine, and then the horses are eating those contaminated areas or drinking from contaminated water sources. It is infectious to people, so it can be spread through urine to humans as well. In small animals, it tends to cause pretty severe liver and kidney disease, so acute liver and kidney failure. In horses, more often it will cause sudden acute blindness. So, you might say, hey, they're a little squinty today. Like, maybe there's just a little dust, and then the next day they're completely blind and panicking. So that's kind of the most common thing that we see. There is some association between lepto infection and recurrent uveitis in horses as well. So that can be a potential cause of recurrent uveitis, or moon blindness is the common name for it. And then the other thing that lepto tends to cause is abortion in horses. So it can cause pregnant mares to lose the foal. So that really kind of depends on your area. If you don't have any standing water sources, then the odds of transmission are lower. Certainly keeping rodents and things like that away from your horses, away from your barn, is going to be helpful in reducing the instances there. And then, vaccinating other animals too, like dogs and things like that can potentially spread it that way too. So, it's relatively common, and we do see a fair amount of it in this area. But, I don't necessarily have a ton of places that will vaccinate for it, but we do have some places along the river. Particularly, we've got the James River that comes through our area, and the Stanton River that is going to be a fairly high risk environment. And so, especially if we start seeing more eye issues at those places, those would be ones where we do actually vaccinate those horses too.
Wow.
So that covers kind of the most common, risk-based vaccines. So I would say, in a really long way of answering Sailor's question, the vaccines that I would recommend for horses that are competing would be your core vaccines. So Eastern encephalitis, Western encephalitis, West Nile, tetanus, rabies, and then flu rhino. And then it's kind of user preference on the strangles. I personally vaccinate for it. So I've had experiences both before and after vet school at boarding barns where one horse comes in and then it spreads like wildfire. My own horse, Tootsie, actually had strangles when I was in high school, and then she got a rare complication secondary to it called purpura hemorrhagica, which is an immune-mediated vasculitis. So basically her legs blew up to about this big around. I thought her hooves were going to fall off. We thought she was going to die for a minute.
Oh my gosh.
She was on a lot of IV antibiotics and steroids, and she did manage to recover and pull through, although she did have some long-lasting complications from the vasculitis. But that being said, because she had an autoimmune reaction to the strangles, I could never vaccinate her again for it. And sometimes this can happen with the flu as well. So it can happen with equine influenza.
Okay.
But because I couldn't vaccinate her, I had to vaccinate all of my others so that way they couldn't bring something back to her. So that way you get some of that herd immunity. And I was also that complete psychopath that was in there bleaching stalls with a sprayer every time I took her to a games competition. I was that weirdo with like the weed sprayer and bleach, like hosing the stalls down.
Not a bad idea.
But it's a rare disease to see when they get the purpura from it. But certainly that is a risk that we can see. And so, that would be something else that you could do to take precautions, is just try to minimize exposure. So minimize nose to nose contact, use your own buckets where you can. Try not to share communal water troughs. You can disinfect the stalls. Bleach is a nice disinfectant. It is inactivated by organic material. So if you're spraying it on like dirt or poop or things like that, it's just going to hit the surface and be deactivated. So a lot of times like chlorhexidine or betadine can be a better option. But ideally, if you're trying to bleach something, you probably want to scrub the dirt off of it first anyway.
I was just curious, whenever you do that, do you take like a cloth and like rub everything down inside the stall? How do you do that?
I just got like one of those little yard sprayers, like the little 3-gallon yard sprayers, and just put the bleach, mixed it with water right then and there, just because you don't want to leave it. Like if you mix it, it'll inactivate after like 24 hours. So just mixed it right then and there and just sprayed everything down till it was soaking wet before I unloaded my horse. So I don't do that now, but I used to. So
not a bad idea,
honestly.
Not a bad idea. So, and if you go places like trail rides, things like that, where they do sometimes have like communal water troughs, I would try to avoid those. Try to bring your own water with you to places. Use your own buckets just to help minimize contamination that way.
What ratio of bleach of water do you use?
It's about a cup of bleach per gallon or so. Usually just a few glugs in a gallon of water. So mixing it super strong doesn't make it more effective. But yeah, so that's
how long do you wait before you put your horse in the stall after you sprayed it down?
About 5 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't take a whole lot. So like, if I pulled up to a venue, first thing I do is spray the stall down and then start, unloading my stuff. And then by the time I've managed to get like the shavings and the other things that I need to get in the stall before I get the horse in, it's already pretty much ready. Yeah. And, these places are pretty open air, so I don't worry too much about respiratory issues, just because everything's got such good ventilation that, that bleach smell is going to be worn off pretty quick.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't hate that idea, to be honest. I mean, with as many places as we go, and
right?
Yeah.
I probably should go back to doing
I've
it.
seen has been horses pulled from auction where we've dealt with strangles.
100%.
Yeah, a lot of that. Even when you put them in quarantine, at some point when you pull them out, I don't think it ever occurred to us to bleach stuff down afterwards.
Right. And
we've had
on that note, any horse that you do get from anywhere, unless you specifically know that person, I always recommend at minimum a 3-week quarantine, because most of your diseases you're going to see break within that 3-week period. Wow. Especially if it's coming from somewhere high traffic like an auction, a horse trader, public sales, things like that. If you're getting it from your neighbor and the horse has never left the property in 15 years, odds are pretty low that it's going to be sharing a communicable disease. You should probably deworm it, but it's still a good idea to quarantine. Yeah. But anything where you don't have a history of, you should absolutely quarantine. And we unfortunately just had an auction here in February where a lot of horses were sold and then subsequently had pockets of strangles outbreaks from said auction. So, it absolutely does happen. So, yeah.
No, it's definitely worth it. So EPM, I have to ask, because I've had multiple cases of exposure in our area. And is there anything people can do to be more careful with it to prevent
prevention? So EPM is spread through possums as the kind of intermediate host. So keeping your feed secure is the biggest thing you can do. You know, keep them out of your hay, keep them out of your feed room, try to keep them out of your pasture if you can. You know, if you minimize the exposure to possums, that's really going to minimize the chances of disease. And honestly, that one's kind of a pain, because if we were to test all the horses in the US, almost 90% of them are going to test positive in some way, shape, or form because they've had exposure, but only a small percentage of those horses are actually going to have the clinical disease.
Yeah.
So the disease is EPM, but the actual protozoa that's spread through the possum feces is Sarcocystis neurona, or sometimes Neospora hugesi. So if we were to test every horse in the US, 90% of them would test positive in some way, but you know, less than 10% of those horses are ever going to have a clinical sign of the disease. So, but prevention is really key on that one.
Yeah.
Secure your feed rooms.
So there's no vaccination we can give them or anything?
No, unfortunately not.
Are there
So,
any other key diseases that you can think of kind of in our region where prevention is key that don't have?
Lyme.
Yeah.
So
That was the one I was thinking of.
Yes. So there is no equine vaccine for Lyme. There are some places that are using the canine CR Lyme off-label for use in horses. From what I hear, they're actually using that canine CR Lyme vaccine to base the model for a human Lyme vaccine as well as equine Lyme. So there's things happening. They're certainly working on it, but you know, that would be the one where I will be the first one in line to find that vaccine when it comes out. So as far as prevention of Lyme disease, really just trying to keep ticks off your horse is the biggest thing. So, you know, there's fly sprays, things like SWAT, you can use it around their coronary bands, trying to minimize places where ticks like to live. So trying to keep them out of the woods, checking them every day. So in order to transmit Lyme disease, the Borrelia burgdorferi bacteria, the tick has to be attached for over 24 hours because they basically have to take that blood meal, kind of process it, alter the bacteria, and then inject it back into the animal to spread Lyme. So it takes more than 24 hours to do that. So if you're checking them every day, which I mean, a horse is a lot, I understand. But if you see them, pulling them off as quick as you can be helpful. I don't find essential oils particularly helpful. In fact, a lot of times I'll find that those are things where I tend to see more skin reactions to them because some of them can be kind of caustic. But, you know, permethrins are pretty good for ticks. So people all have their own preferences. I like Equispot. I've used Ultra Boss. You know, some of my horses seem like they want to get a little skin irritation with Equispot. But usually going to use a permethrin based and have some kind of, you know, SWAT or some kind of ointment, usually around the coronary bands, to help try to stop them crawling up their legs and, you know, keeping the grass lower, and just trying to minimize the amount of, you know, woodland that they have exposure to is going to be helpful.
What about garlic and feed?
You just have to be a little careful with that because garlic is actually toxic to animals. Because horses are so large, you're feeding it in a you know, subtoxic dose, but if fed in large amounts, it can actually cause immune-mediated hemolysis, where the red blood cells sort of explode, and that can cause anemia. So much worse in small animals.
Is that where garlic and vampires came about?
Maybe. So, some unfortunate person just had an issue with the Brassica species, and then they're like, "Ooh, vampire."
Exactly what I thought of too. I was like, wait a minute.
It's dose dependent. So, you know, there's lots of things that we see in horses that are actually toxic that it's hard to feed a high enough level to cause toxicity. Clover, for example, the safranine in clover is actually toxic, but they would have to eat like almost an entire hay bale of clover in one sitting to actually reach a level where you get anything more than the clover slobbers. So, you know, it's physically impossible to eat that much at once, but it technically is toxic to them. So
that makes me feel better.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I didn't know it took that much clover to like affect the horse.
It
Because
takes a
mine
lot.
had slobbers before, and I'm like, oh no,
Right?
they've reached their capacity for toxicity.
No, no. And I personally just think the slobbers are gross. I hate it. I hate
It's
drool.
the worst when you go
And
to
when
a
they
show
like,
in your white breeches and
mhm.
show up and they're just like
Blah.
Or the worst is when the farrier's doing their feet and all of a sudden they open their mouth and they just spit it
just
right
straight
onto the
down
back of
their
their
back.
head. And I'm like, oh no, I'm mortified. So,
Oh.
yes. So, I guess the kind of next thing I wanted to go over a little bit today, as far as travel as well, would be health papers. So,
Oh, that's a good
yes,
point. Yes.
yes. So, what's required to take your horse off of your property is a Coggins test, and so that's a test for equine infectious anemia. It was actually developed by Professor Leroy Coggins, who was a professor at NC State University. So I've seen his office; it's pretty cool.
That's so cool.
Equine infectious anemia is a disease that is spread through biting flies, so like mosquitoes, sable flies, things like that. And most of the time, it causes what's called a paracute disease, where they die very rapidly. And you can occasionally get horses that have, either a subacute or a chronic stage where they have the disease, they're infectious to others around them through biting flies, but they actually manage to survive the initial anemia. And so it used to actually be very, very goodness, prevalent in the US until they started doing the screening and testing. And so it's required either annually or with change of ownership to do a Coggins test if you're leaving the property. Ideally, you should do it anyway just to check. But if your
Yeah.
horse never goes anywhere, then you don't legally have to have one. If you're traveling within state, typically all you'll need is a Coggins unless the venue specifically requires health certificates. If you're crossing state lines, a health certificate is required by the USDA. So that's going to be your
Why do health
CDI.
certificates have such a small window of like effectiveness?
So it's because we want to track those reportable diseases. So encephalitis, herpes virus, influenza, things like that. So that way, if you've got a short window, then we're able to say, hey, this is where that horse has been in the last 30 days. Then they can track everyone that was maybe at that same venue. So say a horse comes into the Grange, they compete, this past weekend with a bunch of other horses that came in from all over the place. And then now today they've tested positive for influenza. So then the state health departments for each of those states are going to get notified about who was at this venue, and then they can follow the disease and they can do the appropriate quarantines. Because a lot of these can spread like wildfire, and then you've got a huge outbreak, and you don't know where these horses have gone. I agree, Joy. I really wish people would check them more, but I think it's really good that you have them because a lot of places don't check. However, if you were to get pulled over on the road and the policeman asks for your health certificate and you don't have it, you are going to get a hefty fine for each horse on the trailer that does not have that health certificate.
I heard they could confiscate the horse and like your whole rig basically.
They can hold it,
okay.
but they can't like take it forever.
Still
I mean,
to
unless
deal
you
with,
have some kind of like awful reportable disease, then they might be able to. But health certificates generally are good for 30 days. Some places require them within like 7 days or 10 days. I think Tryon Equestrian Center, yours is supposed to be within 7 days of the competition, just because that gives you a more accurate window of if the horse is okay or not. Because a lot can happen in 30 days. And so you only have to have them to cross state lines unless the venue requires them for all horses. Okay. So that would be a venue preference rather than like a USDA preference. So 14 days.
Only 14 days. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So Tryon requires them for all horses coming in, but say a different place in North Carolina, they might not require it for another North Carolina horse to go there. But I live in Virginia, so if I go to Morven Park, I don't necessarily need a health certificate. But if I go to West Jefferson or go to the Grange or go to, Prince George, I need a health certificate. They do actually have extended equine CVIs, which are your 6-month health certificates. Look at that, Courtney's on the same page.
Wow.
They work very well in the South. However, some of the states for the North don't cover them. So I've actually, can you guys still hear me? If I change tabs, do I disappear? Okay.
No, you're still there.
So I've got a list of the states that include those, which the shorter list would be actually to tell you the states that don't. So the states that won't allow you to have a 6-month health certificate are Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Delaware, Ohio, and then some states a little bit further out. So there's only about 14 of the states that do not allow.
Is one of those big central states for us.
Yeah, PA and New Jersey. So all of the southern people can really do pretty well with the 6-month CVIs, but Maryland does include it, but Pennsylvania, New Jersey, unfortunately don't take it yet. So the list actually used to be shorter. So more and more states every year are starting to allow you to do the extended CVIs. So eventually it may cover it, but for now, us mid-Atlantic people are not on the 6-month list. So
up north.
Yep. And if you go to I use Global Vet Link, but if you go to Global Vet Link and look up EECVI, it'll tell you exactly what states cover it and which ones don't. So, but those basically, you'll have the vet come out, examine the horse, do the pictures, because electronic Coggins and health certificates have become the standard since I want to say 2019. So they like the pictures rather than the hand-drawn ones, which is nice because all those with horses with spots, it's terrible trying to draw those pictures. So, and my horse has a lot of spots. So,
I remember when people used to do that with my leopards, and they
my God,
they just started getting
probably hated you. But
it'd be like 3 back to back.
Right? Oh my goodness. Yes. No, I'm really glad that we do have the pictures now, because that does make life much easier and much more identifiable too. Pictures worth 1,000 words. So, but yeah, so I think over time we'll get more of those. But essentially what happens with the 6-month health certificates is the vet examines the horse, does the pictures, enters the description. And then as the owner, it's your responsibility to then check the horse for coughing, for nasal discharge, to take its temperature and make sure it doesn't have a fever, which in horses, a normal temperature is between 99.5 and 101.5. So foals can run a little warmer. They can go up to like 102, but those are like babies, not horses that are going to be riding. And so, it's up to the owner to list the travel dates, how they're planning on traveling. Are you trailering? Is someone else trailering? Who's trailering? If it's not you, the physical address, phone number, and county of the place that they're going. And then to record the horse's temperature, and essentially it's the honor system of whether your horse has signs of a disease or not. So that's kind of how they track it. But then they still have track of that movement. So if there is an outbreak, they can go back and see which horses were at that venue at that time that need to be contacted as far as quarantine or testing. And, if there is an infectious disease outbreak, normally when the state vet gets involved, a lot of times the state is covering that testing as well. So they're going to be the ones going out and doing samples and stuff. So typically, if you're part of an exposure, there's not going to be a lot of added cost to you, because that's the state that's coming in and taking over. So, which is always a stressful time.
Interesting question.
So depending on preference, there's a few good feed through fly controls. So I use Simplify. I find that seems to really help reduce the number of flies. Fly predators are also a really good option. I've used those a couple years and had pretty decent results as well. But you, from what I understand, you don't want to use them with the feed through fly control, because otherwise those can kill your fly predators, and that kind of negates the point of buying them if you're accidentally killing them. So that would just kind of be the main thing. I also will use fly bait So it's essentially like birth control for flies, but I'll put that out in the stables. And so that essentially stops them laying eggs. So it doesn't really kill them, but they can't reproduce. And then that helps. So I use like quick bait or things like that. I can't remember. There was a different brand I used before the quick bait, but I liked it better because they were little white granules. The quick bait is little like red granules. And when my shelter leaks, it looked like someone was bleeding everywhere. And then I finally discovered that no horses were bleeding. It was just where it had gotten wet. So
oh my gosh, that's scary.
I was like, oh my God, why is there blood all over the floor? But so yeah, there's lots of different options, but I use the Simplify as a feed through, and it seems like they tolerate it pretty well. It is, dependent on horse weight. So obviously for ponies, you're going to use a smaller dose, but it tells you how to use it, and it comes with its own scoop. So it's pretty easy to use.
And you feel like it does make an impact?
I definitely feel like it makes an impact. I also use their reusable like bait stations as well. So it's like a plastic thing, and you put the fly attractant in there. The flies fly in, they can't get out, and then they drown in the water. So you can actually dump those out and refill them with the fly attractant. So I use those as well.
Cool.
And the flies are already out. Like my horses are covered. They are getting fly sprayed, and they're getting their fly masks on. It's only March. It's awful.
It's actually a good time to start thinking about that, like for prevention, to start breaking the cycle.
Yes. So I thought I had some Simplify left over from last year, but I didn't. So mine's already on order. It should eventually appear at my house sometime.
Going back to ticks real quick, because every year I feel like I've always gotten like the topical stuff to put on my horse, where you're supposed to put it on their pole and then their neck and then their back and then their legs and stuff like that. Would you recommend that, or would you recommend
everything? Do all the things.
How often?
So it depends on the product. So if you're using something like EquiSpot, typically it's going to last for 14 days. So usually you'll reapply at 14 days. There are some people that use Vectra 3D, which is actually a dog flea tick, and that one's going to be monthly, but you're using 3 of the large dog ones, so it's pretty expensive to use that one. It runs around $400, I think, for a month of doing that. So
Carly's
scratching that out.
Yeah, I mean, I think EquiSpot or Ultra Boss are good options. They're more affordable. I would test it first on a small spot, because I did find that one of my horses got like just welts where I kind of had put it on them. But all the others have tolerated it really well. And it wasn't even the first year I used it. It was like the 3rd year that I was using it that all of a sudden one had a reaction. So, I would say the topical of your choice, whether it's a fly spray, whether it's a pour on. I really like the wipe on fly spray. So it comes in a green, I think it's from Farnham. It comes in a green pourable bottle, and we would pour it on rags and wipe it all over them. I know what you're talking about. Get all over my skin. It's probably not great for me, but it kept the bugs off me. So
good for ticks too, or just flies?
It says it is, but I feel like it's not. But I did find that worked. I used a sprayable version, and 3 out of 3 of my horses got welts from it. So I'm not a big fan of their spray. The Endurafly spray is really good as well. And it tends not to sweat off. I'd say it's probably one of the more effective ones. At least it says it lasts 2 weeks. There's no way. Maybe you get a day, but some of them only seem to last like 20 minutes. So it's better than that. But yeah.
Oh, good to know. Thank you, Sailor. My gelding's a tick magnet, and the black Ultra Shield made a huge difference for him.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, everyone has their own favorite products that seem like they work super well. And if it's working for you, absolutely go for it. But definitely managing the environment is going to be important. Getting the manure out is helpful. Trying to keep your manure pile away from the barn. Trying to minimize environments that ticks like to live in is helpful. Standing water, any standing water sources we want to try to eliminate, because mosquitoes come from there. I have goldfish in my water troughs because they eat the mosquito larvae, and it doesn't seem like it bothers the horses. So I feed the goldfish in the winter when there's no bugs, and in the summer they just eat their little hearts out on bugs, and they're about this big now. Like, they're massive. They
I love
started out as
that.
those tiny little 25-cent feeder goldfish from the pet store, and now they look like koi. So,
Living their best life.
mhm.
That's pretty cool, actually. That's a good idea.
Yeah, you should do that, Genevieve.
I know.
We
Right?
have automatic waterers where
The
I
goldfish
board,
might not like
so-
that.
No, it's gonna work out so great.
Oh, excellent. Do you guys have any other questions on like fly stuff? Because I've got a whole nother section on like deworming recommendations if you guys want to go into that.
Oh, I think
So,
deworming is super important. We should try to cover that, even though we only have
excellent.
a few minutes left. So go.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
I'll talk super fast. Okay. So, the recommendation used to be to rotate dewormers, and they actually found that created resistance in worms. So,
Really?
yes. So the parasitologists have gone in and kind of studied that. And basically what would happen is when you would rotate dewormers, you would kill off the susceptible worms and say maybe you killed off 90% of them. And then those resistant worms would just be kind of sitting there existing. And whether they're resistant because they're completely resistant to the drug, or whether they're just resistant to it because they, don't have a high enough dose is, to be determined. But when you then deworm with something else, then you kill off all those susceptible worms. And so when you do rotational deworming, essentially you're killing off all the weaklings and then allowing the stronger worms to breed. And this really became a major issue in goats, in that they have a parasite called Haemonchus contortus that causes severe anemia. And they only have really one dewormer that's even effective left to use in goats because of all the resistance that's occurred. So the recommendation is actually not to rotate dewormers. The most effective ones to use in most adult horses are going to be either ivermectin or moxidectin based dewormers. So moxidectin would be like your Quest or your Quest Plus. And the recommendation is actually to check a fecal egg count on the horse. And so you can also check a fecal egg count on the group of horses. And if they're less than 200 eggs per gram, typically deworming just once to twice a year, depending on their exposure, is going to be adequate. And that once a year should also include something to deworm against bots and against tapeworms, because those are not typically going to show up in a fecal. So bots, those are those little yellow eggs that are on excellent. Those little eggs that are on their legs. The bot fly is actually attached to the lining of the stomach, so sometimes you'll see them on a scope. So those you're not really going to see any eggs coming out in the stool. Same with tapeworms. The tapeworm eggs oftentimes are going to be enclosed in those little tapeworm segments, so you don't tend to see them. Tapeworms in horses can cause intestinal blockages in high amounts, so it's important to deworm with something like either Quest Plus or Iberheart Max. Also takes care of tapeworms too. So once a year after the first hard frost, which in Virginia might be, I don't know, February was when we maybe finally got a frost. Where Joy is, she probably has frost like October, November, because they get winter up there. We had fake winter where it kind of got cold and then really didn't. So it's a little trickier here. And then, if you have 5 horses and you check a fecal on a group, and it's below that threshold, wonderful. You just kind of stick with that. If it becomes above that 200 egg per gram threshold, then you should check the individual horses. And ideally you should check the individuals, because some are going to be what are called high shedders, and they tend to be fewer numbers in the population. So in a field of 10 horses, you might have one that's a high shedder. And those horses need to have more frequent dewormings, but it's recommended to kind of pick a product that you like, that works, and to stick with it. So my horse Summer, that typically looks like a fat cow walking around the field with her giant belly and her nice shiny copper penny coat, she is a high shedder. Every time I check a fecal on her, she is full of worms.
Oh, wow.
And it's probably because she eats everything in sight and keeps reinfecting herself. Because if it will fit in her mouth, she will eat it. Like she'll eat trees on trail rides. Like she'll just grab a tree branch and eat it.
Thing's gone.
But for horses like that, the question is, does she have a high count because she has a resistant worm population, or does she have a high count because she's reinfecting herself? And so then what can be done is a fecal egg count reduction test, which is you check your fecal, you deworm with whatever product it is that you prefer, Quest or, Iverhart Max, whichever one, ivermectin. And then you recheck fecal egg count about 14 days later, because the strongyle life cycle is 14 days. So usually I'll, go slightly longer, maybe day 16. And if the fecal then goes to negative, that says, oh, okay, it's not the problem with the dewormer. The dewormer works. The problem is either the environment or wherever she's getting reinfected. And so then we know our dewormer is effective. If the egg count doesn't change, then we say, okay, we've got a resistant population. Let's switch to a different class of dewormer. Okay. Bulls and horses that have had little care will require a little bit different of a deworming program because they have a lot of exposure. And if you have a horse with tons of worms, like particularly babies are very susceptible to worms, or adult horses that maybe just haven't had a lot of routine care, those animals we want to be a little more careful with deworming, because if they've got bazillions of worms in there and then we deworm them, it can actually cause an impaction because so many worms die and then they get stuck in the intestines and then they colic. Wow. So those have a little bit more specifically catered programs, but in general for your average adult horse, once or twice a year tends to be adequate. For more of the southern states where you have, a longer growing season, a lot of times I'll deworm in the fall after the first frost. So usually that's like December, but then I'll oftentimes deworm again in like April-ish when the grass is really starting to grow and come out, because a lot of times the parasites will become dormant over the winter and then they'll kind of reemerge as the weather starts warming up, which is unfortunate that parasites are slightly smart, because they'd be a lot easier to get rid of if they weren't. But, for places that are a little more northern where you have a longer cold season and maybe not as much exposure, you may be able to get away with once a year. Or if you just have, one or two horses that don't really go anywhere, they're not getting a lot of exposure to parasites, you could sometimes get away with once a year, but usually once or twice a year tends to be adequate for those that are not your high shedders.
Is there like a rule when you are worming your horse with how much time you should give them before they go back to work, or they go out and travel, or they go compete, do something strenuous?
Usually not. So I think the biggest thing is going to be, I don't want the dewormer to sit in their mouth forever. So like if they've just been sedated for some kind of procedure, I wouldn't want to, to give it and then have it sit there, because sometimes it can be irritating to their gums. Gotcha. But in general, it doesn't tend to affect them in a big way. If they've got a really heavy burden, I probably want to give them a day or two just to kind of kill everything off, but they tend to work pretty quick. But for your average horse that doesn't have a whole lot of worms that you're just routinely deworming, typically they don't need any type of special care. The dewormer is going to kill what's there as an adult when you give it. Anything that's already in their system as an egg or a larvae typically is not going to get taken out. So that's why we do, once or twice a year, we're just kind of knocking out a lot of that other stuff. But adult horses will also start to build some of their own natural immunity against the worms too. So especially like ascarids, which are really common in young horses, it's rare to see in adults because they've started to build that natural immunity. So
Sailor says, last question. This is a little bit off topic of what we were just talking about, but she says, how often do you recommend people to consult with a nutritionist, and do you have a favorite brand of feed?
Yeah, so nutrition is really one of the big things that we talk about. And so I've got a fair amount of experience with nutrition from just owning older horses or fat horses that need special care. So, for things where they just need a little push in the right direction, a lot of times we can cover that on farm. But for ones that are more complicated or have known allergens or specific medical conditions, oftentimes we are really kind of pushing towards having that nutrition consult, because we have to be a little bit limited in what we can and can't have. Things like insulin resistance or equine metabolic syndrome, we have to be really careful with the sugars and the starches, and fructans also kind of fall into that starch category too. And so, those, it's really nice to then have that nutritionist come through. And especially, getting the hay tested, things like that can be really beneficial. A lot of times it's more so adjusting the quantity of food rather than the quality. I've had a couple where I'm like, your horse foundered because you're feeding it straight corn. Let's not do that. So there's quite a few where we just have to kind of adjust the amount rather than really make a whole lot of other specific recommendations, because I think a lot of people equate food with love. And just because you feed them more doesn't mean you love them more. We want them to be at an appropriate weight because of all the issues that can occur with obesity and, other end of the spectrum being undernourished. But I would say, the vast majority of what I see is that we just need little adjustments here and there, as far as more so quantity rather than the type of feed. But certainly, I would say at least a couple times a year, we're recommending nutrition consults, or depending on the season, usually spring will be more often. But a lot of times it's more so just taking those precautions against, hey, the grass is coming in, it's time to put the grazing muzzle on, or your horse's crest has fallen off the side of its neck, why are you giving it sweet feed? Things like that.
Another one that kind of takes us back in the warming direction, and then we'll probably wrap it up there. And
okay, excellent. I really don't find it matters either way. I find that it's going to be absorbed fairly well either way. I tend to prefer to give dewormers with feed because I find that, sometimes that feed can also help kind of move some of it out of their mucous membranes as well. But I really don't have a preference as far as that.
Kimberly has a great question. Caroline, will you return?
I didn't make it that far.
To have a fun conversation about what is in your first aid box?
Yes. And mine includes a stomach tube, and I'm assuming probably most of yours doesn't.
No, it does not.
That was one of my things when I first started doing games again. One of my good friends is a veterinary technician, so I was like, well, what do I need to bring? Like, obviously I'm going to have, bute and things like that, bring some electrolytes, but, I was like, should I bring the stomach tube? Do I bring that? I don't know. And she's like, oh my God, you're an idiot. But mine's probably a little bit more extensive than most people's, because I've got supplies for lacerations and probably a stomach tube. But I'm assuming most people are not going to be tackling that on their own, but that was definitely one of the things on my list that I wanted to go over today and then ran out of time
let's
for.
Definitely, let's meet up again in maybe 2-3 weeks and do this again. And I think it'd be awesome to talk about what's in your first aid box, what's in your travel checklist too.
Oh yes, I think I posted that on the games website that was on my all of my remember to pack this stuff, and I tend to have most stuff pre-packed. I also had on my list of things to talk about was which I didn't actually get to the performance horse part of this. I just kept babbling on. But I did talk about
again, so you have a full hour.
Conditioning. Yes,
absolutely.
Appropriate conditioning. I really wanted to talk about hoof angles as well, because everyone's heard the phrase "no hoof, no horse," but also there are things that can be adjusted that can help reduce the chance of injuries as well. So that was on my list. And then I think I also had joint care and things like that on the list as well. So
if you want Caroline back, please like this show, and we'll try to bring her back in the next week or two if she's available.
I was going to say,
excellent.
I think we've got a lot of content.
Maybe next week or April or sometime, because I feel like we've got a lot more we could discuss. Yeah.
I've got my cow vet coming out for the cows next Wednesday, so I may or may not be dead, depending on how compliable they are. But hopefully not. But we'll see if I survive that. Absolutely.
Awesome.
So, I've got tons of stuff to talk about.
Thank you so much for watching. Caroline, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sorry I'm cutting this off. It's just so that we roll this into next week.
Yep. Absolutely. Yes, I've got a million things to talk about, so I could just keep talking for all eternity.
And thank you so much for joining us again. Like, this honestly has been really enlightening and really kind of gears you up to start thinking, okay, spring. And a lot of people, first time with spring shots, like, this is so good.
Yes.
I feel so much more
appreciate
confident
you.
now for
Spring
when the vet
shots.
comes.
Get your Coggins, because you got to get that in the Coggins repository, and that's important for competitions. Don't be like me where you only sent one and forgot to send the other. So
we all been there.
Yeah.
All right,
and then,
guys, have a good evening.
Plan ahead, because spring is a busy season. So like, if you need your health certificates, don't call the day before.
It's a good point too.
Yes. Excellent.
All
Thank you,
Stick
guys.
around, Caroline. It's got to upload after, and I forgot to tell you that before. But guys, we will see you next week.
Right.
Thank you. Bye.